On the morning of February 12, 1943 at 9:37, Lieutenant Takeo Tanemizu banked his A6M50 into a lazy turn above Rabaul at 22,000 feet, watching a formation of strange American fighters approaching from the southeast through broken clouds. The new aircraft looked absurdly fat to him, with wings that bent down from the fuselage like some deformed gull, and engines that seemed too large for their frames. Through his canopy he could see five other Zeros from his squadron spreading out in attack formation, their pilots chattering excitedly over the radio about the peculiar American machines that had just arrived in the theater. At 26 years old, Tanemizu was a veteran of the China campaigns and the early Pacific battles who had logged over 400 combat hours in the Zero, most of them at altitudes where his nimble fighter dominated everything in the sky. His squadron commander had briefed them that morning about reports of a new American carrier fighter called the Corsair, supposedly equipped with a 2,000-horsepower engine that made it faster than anything the Japanese Navy had encountered. But looking at the ungainly silhouettes climbing toward his position, Tanemizu felt only confidence. The Americans were still 8,000 feet below, laboring upward through thin air where Japanese fighters had ruled since the war began. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. For nearly 2 years, Japanese pilots had built their tactical doctrine around a simple principle that had proven itself in 1,000 engagements, from Pearl Harbor to Guadalcanal. The Zero was lighter, more maneuverable, and climbed faster than any Allied fighter in service. At altitudes above 15,000 feet, where the air grew thin and engines struggled for oxygen, the Zero's lightweight construction and efficient supercharger gave it an advantage that American pilots could not overcome through skill or courage. F4F Wildcats that tried to climb after Zeros found themselves wallowing in thin air, while Japanese fighters danced overhead, picking their moment to dive and attack. The tactic was so reliable that Zero pilots had grown accustomed to treating altitude as their personal sanctuary, a place where they could retreat when damaged or low on ammunition, knowing American fighters could not follow effectively. But the Corsairs approaching that morning represented something the Japanese had not anticipated, a fundamental shift in engineering philosophy that would challenge assumptions Japanese pilots had relied upon since the war's beginning. While Zero designers had achieved performance by stripping away weight, armor protection, and self-sealing fuel tanks, American engineers at Chancevoort had taken the opposite approach. They had built the heaviest single-engine fighter in the American arsenal around the most powerful engine available, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial that produced 2,000 horsepower at takeoff and maintained that power far higher than anything in the Japanese inventory. The F4U Corsair that entered service in early 1943 weighed 9,982 pounds, empty, compared to the Zero's 3,774 pounds. To Japanese pilots accustomed to fighters that felt like extensions of their own bodies, the Corsair appeared grotesquely overbuilt, carrying armor plating behind the pilot, self-sealing fuel tanks in the wings, and 6 50-caliber machine guns that alone weighed more than some European fighters' entire armament. American test pilots at Patuxent River had logged hundreds of hours, evaluating the new fighter's performance envelope, documenting capabilities that would reshape aerial combat in the Pacific. The Corsair could reach 415 miles per hour in level flight at 19,900 feet, making it faster than any Japanese fighter except perhaps the latest Frank interceptors that had not yet reached the theater in significant numbers. But speed alone did not tell the complete story of what made the Corsair revolutionary. The R2800 engine was equipped with a 2-stage supercharger that compressed intake air twice before feeding it to the cylinders, a system that maintained sea-level power output far higher into the atmosphere than the Zero's single-stage design could manage. At altitudes where the Zero's Sake engine began losing power, struggling against thinning oxygen content, the Corsair's supercharger was just reaching its optimal operating range. Engineering reports from Chancevoort's testing facility in Stratford, Connecticut, showed that the F4U maintained excellent climb performance up to 25,000 feet, with a rate of climb exceeding 2,900 feet per minute at sea level. The aircraft could reach 20,000 feet in approximately 7 minutes, a climb rate that matched or exceeded the Zero's performance at those altitudes. The supercharger system was more complex than anything Japanese engineers had attempted to put into production aircraft. The first stage compressor spun at engine speed, driven directly by the crankshaft through a series of gears. The compressed air from the first stage then passed through an intercooler that reduced its temperature before entering the second stage compressor, which spun even faster to achieve additional compression. The intercooled system prevented the extreme temperatures that would otherwise cause detonation in the cylinders, while allowing the engine to maintain manifold pressures that naturally aspirated engines could never achieve at altitude. This dual-stage compression meant that at 20,000 feet, where atmospheric pressure was only 2/3 of sea level, the Corsair's engine was still receiving air at pressures that allowed it to produce power comparable to what it generated at 10,000 feet. Japanese intelligence officers had studied captured American aircraft manuals and technical specifications throughout 1942, analyzing the performance characteristics of Wildcats, Airacobras, and Lightnings. They had identified weaknesses in each design, limitations that could be exploited by Japanese pilots who understood how to force American fighters into unfavorable engagement parameters. The Wildcat was slow and could not climb with a Zero. The Airacobra lost power rapidly above 15,000 feet, where its single-stage supercharger became ineffective. Even the twin-engine Lightning, despite its speed, could be defeated by experienced Zero pilots who knew how to exploit its poor maneuverability at low speeds. But the intelligence reports on the Corsair contained numbers that did not fit the patterns Japanese pilots had learned to expect. The Zero A6M5 Model 52 that Tanamizu flew that morning was considered the refined version of the design that had dominated Pacific skies since 1941. It featured a Nakajima Sake 21 engine, producing 1,130 horsepower at takeoff, driving a 3-blade propeller through a simple gearbox. The aircraft could reach 351 miles per hour at 20,000 feet and could climb to that altitude in 7 minutes and 1 second. But those performance figures represented the aircraft operating at its optimal conditions, with a skilled pilot managing throttle and mixture settings to extract maximum efficiency from the engine. In practice, sustained combat at high altitude degraded the Zero's performance significantly as pilots maneuvered violently, opened throttles wide, and burned fuel at rates that reduced the aircraft's weight advantage. The Corsair pilots climbing toward Tanamizu's position that morning were members of VMF 124, the first Marine squadron to receive the new fighters in theater. They had spent the previous 2 weeks learning the aircraft's capabilities, discovering strengths that their F4F Wildcat experience had not prepared them for. Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh, flying as element leader in the formation, had already begun developing the tactics that would make him the first Corsair ace. He understood something that Japanese pilots had not yet grasped, that the Corsair's advantages became more pronounced as altitude increased, not less. At 20,000 feet, the aircraft could still accelerate rapidly, could still climb at respectable rates, and, most importantly, could use its superior diving speed to control engagement ranges. Walsh had learned during training that altitude was the key to everything in the Corsair. Unlike the Wildcat, which became sluggish above 15,000 feet and practically helpless above 20,000, the Corsair remained responsive and powerful at altitudes where most fighters struggled. The R-2800's 2-stage supercharger was working hardest precisely where Japanese fighters began losing their advantage. The intercooler system kept intake air temperatures manageable, preventing the detonation that plagued single-stage supercharged engines when pilots tried to maintain full power at altitude. This meant Corsair pilots could hold throttle settings that would destroy other aircraft, maintaining power output that Japanese pilots assumed was impossible for single-engine American fighters. The tactical implications were profound, but not yet understood by either side in February 1943. Japanese pilots approaching their first combat against Corsairs expected to exploit the same advantages that had served them against every other American fighter. They would climb above the Americans, use their superior altitude to choose engagement timing, and dive down in slashing attacks that leveraged the Zeros' excellent maneuverability. If the Americans tried to climb after them, the Zeros would simply climb higher, maintaining their sanctuary in the thin air where Wildcats could not follow. It was a tactic that had worked hundreds of times against American pilots who flew aircraft without the power to compete at altitude. But the Marines climbing toward Rabaul that morning were not flying Wildcats. They were flying fighters that could maintain power output at altitudes where Japanese calculations broke down. Every 1,000 feet of altitude they gained narrowed the performance gap between the two aircraft, reducing the Zero's advantages while highlighting the Corsairs' superior speed, armament, and structural strength. The Japanese pilots circling overhead, confident in their altitude advantage, were about to discover that the rules of engagement had changed in ways their training and experience had not prepared them to understand. Tanemizu rolled his Zero onto its back and pulled through into a diving attack, aiming for the nearest Corsair climbing through 18,000 feet. His 3 squadron mates followed, spacing themselves to allow clean shots without risk of collision. The Zero accelerated smoothly in the dive, reaching speeds that would have torn apart lighter aircraft, but that the rugged Japanese fighter handled easily. Tanemizu centered his gun sight on the Corsair's broad fuselage, noting how the bent wing design made the American fighter easy to identify even at long range. He waited until the range closed to 600 meters before pressing the firing button, sending 20mm cannon shells and 7.7mm machine gun rounds toward the target. The Corsair pilot saw the attacking Zero and reacted with a maneuver that surprised Tanemizu. Instead of trying to turn away, which would have given the Zero an easy deflection shot with its superior turning radius, the American pushed his nose down and accelerated away in a shallow dive. The Corsair's speed advantage became immediately apparent as it pulled away from the pursuing Zeros, opening the range faster than Tanemizu had seen any American fighter manage. He pulled out of his dive at 15,000 feet and began climbing back to altitude, expecting the Corsair to break off and return to lower altitudes where American fighters typically operated. Instead, the Corsair leveled off, came around in a wide turn, and began climbing again, heading right back toward the Japanese formation at 20,000 feet. This was not how American fighters were supposed to behave. Wildcats that survived initial attacks would dive away and stay low, using their superior roll rate and dive speed to escape, while Japanese fighters held altitude advantage. But the Corsairs kept coming back, climbing through altitudes where they should have been helpless, maintaining power and speed that forced Japanese pilots to reassess their tactical assumptions. Tanemizu watched another Zero make a slashing attack on a climbing Corsair, only to have the American fighter absorb the hits, continue climbing, and come around for another engagement. The armor and self-sealing tanks that made the Corsair so much heavier than the Zero were now proving their worth, allowing American pilots to survive hits that would have destroyed lighter aircraft. The engagement developed into a complex, swirling fight that spread across 10,000 feet of altitude and several miles of airspace. Zero pilots found that their traditional advantage in slow-speed turning was less useful than expected because Corsair pilots refused to engage in those fights. Instead, the Americans used their superior speed to control engagement ranges, diving away when threatened and climbing back to altitude before Japanese pilots could consolidate their position. The Corsairs' 650 caliber machine guns had greater range and hitting power than the Zero's mixed armament, allowing American pilots to open fire at distances where Japanese return fire was ineffective. But the most disturbing development for Tanemizu came when he found himself at 24,000 feet, trying to maintain altitude advantage over a Corsair that kept climbing toward him. He advanced his throttle to full power, feeling the Zero's controls grow mushy in the thin air as the aircraft struggled to maintain energy. The Corsair below him continued its steady climb, not as fast as the Zero, but fast enough that the altitude advantage was gradually disappearing. Tanemizu tried to turn inside the Americans' climb path, hoping to position for another diving attack, but the Zero's performance at altitude was degrading noticeably. The engine was producing perhaps 70% of its rated power, starved for oxygen, despite the supercharger's best efforts. Meanwhile, the Corsair's two-stage supercharger was still maintaining manifold pressures that gave the R2800 engine nearly full power. The American pilot could maintain his climb rate far higher than the Zero pilot anticipated, could maintain speed that prevented easy deflection shots, and most importantly, could repeat this performance engagement after engagement without suffering the progressive degradation that affected Japanese fighters operating at maximum power for extended periods. The Zero's lightweight construction and minimal cooling systems meant that sustained high-power operation caused temperatures to rise, forcing pilots to reduce power settings or risk engine damage. The Corsair's massive radial engine and efficient cooling system allowed American pilots to hold full power indefinitely at altitudes where Japanese fighters had to throttle back. The engagement ended inconclusively after 30 minutes of scattered fighting across the sky above Rabaul. Both sides claimed victories, as was typical in the chaotic confusion of aerial combat where multiple aircraft attacked the same targets and damaged aircraft disappeared into clouds without clear resolution of their fate. But Japanese pilots returning to base brought back reports that troubled their commanders. The new American fighters were not performing according to the patterns established by 2 years of combat experience. They were climbing to altitudes that where American fighters were supposed to be ineffective. They were maintaining speed and power at 20,000 feet and above, where the Zero's advantages should have been overwhelming. Most concerning of all, they were demonstrating the confidence to remain at altitude and continue fighting, rather than breaking off to lower altitudes where previous American fighters had been forced to operate. Tanemizu filed his combat report that afternoon, describing the engagement and noting the Corsair's unusual performance characteristics. He recommended that squadron tactics be modified to account for the American fighters' ability to maintain power at altitude, suggesting that Zero pilots should no longer assume altitude provided the complete sanctuary it had offered against earlier American types. His recommendations were forwarded to higher headquarters, where staff officers began analyzing the implications of American fighters that could compete with Zeros in the vertical dimension. The analysis would take weeks to complete, and by then, hundreds of Japanese pilots would have encountered Corsairs and discovered for themselves that the rules of aerial combat in the Pacific were changing in ways that favored American engineering philosophy over Japanese emphasis on lightweight agility. The February 12th engagement was the first of dozens that would occur over Rabaul and the Solomon Islands throughout 1943, as Marine Corsair squadrons established themselves in the theater and developed the tactics that would exploit their aircraft strengths. The pattern that emerged was clear to pilots on both sides. At low altitudes, below 10,000 feet, the Zero retained significant advantages in turning performance and could still defeat Corsairs flown by inexperienced pilots who tried to dogfight on Japanese terms. But at altitudes above 15,000 feet, the Corsair's superior power-to-weight ratio at altitude, combined with its speed and armament advantages, gave American pilots the edge in engagements. The higher the fight went, the more pronounced the Corsair's advantages became, until at 25,000 feet and above, the Zero was simply outclassed by an American fighter that could maintain performance where the Japanese aircraft struggled. The two-stage supercharger that made this possible was a complex piece of engineering that represented years of development by Pratt and Whitney's engineers. The system used 2 centrifugal compressors arranged in series, each driven by the engine through a sophisticated gearing system. The first-stage compressor, called the auxiliary supercharger, operated at all times and provided moderate boost pressure. The second-stage compressor, or main supercharger, could be engaged at higher altitudes through a fluid coupling that allowed smooth transitions between single-stage and two-stage operation. Between the 2 stages, the compressed air passed through an intercooler that used ambient air flowing through ducts in the wing roots to reduce intake air temperature by as much as 150 degrees Fahrenheit. This temperature reduction was critical because compressing air heats it significantly, and hot intake air is less dense and more prone to causing detonation when compressed further in the engine's cylinders. By cooling the air between compression stages, the intercooler allowed much higher final boost pressures without the overheating problems that plagued simpler supercharger designs. The system was heavy, complex, and expensive to manufacture, requiring precision machining and careful assembly to achieve the tight tolerances needed for reliable operation. But the performance advantage it provided at altitude was worth every pound of weight and every dollar of cost, transforming the Corsair from just another fast fighter into an aircraft that could dominate Japanese fighters in the vertical dimension. Japanese engineers had experimented with two-stage supercharging for the Zero and other fighters, but production difficulties and resource constraints had prevented these systems from reaching service aircraft in significant numbers. A prototype A6M4 with experimental turbo supercharging had been tested in 1942, but the project was abandoned when the complex system proved unreliable and too difficult to manufacture with available resources. Instead, Japanese fighters continued using single-stage superchargers that provided adequate performance at the altitudes where most combat occurred, but that left them vulnerable to American fighters equipped with more sophisticated forced induction systems. By March 1943, reports from Rabaul and the Solomons were reaching Japanese Naval Aviation Headquarters in Tokyo, describing encounters with Corsairs at altitudes above 20,000 feet, where American fighters were supposed to be at a disadvantage. Staff officers studied the intelligence, trying to understand how American engineers had achieved performance characteristics that seemed to defy the limitations that constrained Japanese designs. The answer, they gradually realized, lay in fundamental philosophical differences about how to build a fighter aircraft. Japanese design philosophy emphasized minimum weight to maximize maneuverability and climb rate, accepting compromises in armor protection, fuel capacity, and structural strength. American philosophy emphasized maximum power to overcome weight, using supercharging technology to maintain that power at altitude. The Corsair represented American engineering philosophy taken to its logical conclusion. Instead of trying to make the aircraft lighter, chance-fought engineers had made it stronger and more powerful, building a fighter that could absorb battle damage, carry heavy weapon loads, and maintain performance at altitudes where lighter fighters struggled. The approach worked because American industrial capacity could support the complex manufacturing processes required for two-stage superchargers, intercoolers, and the massive forged crankshafts needed to handle the R-2800's power output. Japanese industry, stretched thin by commitments across the Pacific and unable to match American production capacity, could not afford to build fighters using such resource-intensive approaches. The tactical revolution that began over Rabaul in February 1943 accelerated throughout the spring and summer as more Marine squadrons received Corsairs and developed the techniques that would exploit the aircraft's strengths. F4U, the first squadron to fly the type in combat, learned through hard experience that the Corsair was not a dogfighter in the traditional sense. Pilots who tried to turn with Zeros at low altitude found themselves at a fatal disadvantage, watching the nimble Japanese fighters outmaneuver them with ease. But pilots who maintained altitude and speed, who used the Corsair's superior power to dictate engagement terms, found they could dominate Japanese fighters with relative impunity. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The learning curve was steep and paid for in pilots' lives. On February 14, 1943, just 2 days after the first Corsairs arrived at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, 12 F4U-1s escorted a formation of Liberator bombers on a raid against the Japanese airfield at Kahili. The Japanese scrambled a large force of Zeros to intercept, and in the confused battle that followed, the Americans lost 2 Corsairs, 2 Liberators, 4 P-38 Lightnings, and 2 P-40 Warhawks. Marine pilots called it the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, a sobering reminder that the Corsairs' technical advantages meant nothing if pilots did not understand how to employ them effectively. The engagement taught crucial lessons about maintaining energy, avoiding slow-speed turning fights, and using the aircraft's superior firepower at ranges where Japanese return fire was less effective. By April 1943, the tactical picture was becoming clearer. Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh of VMF 124 had emerged as one of the first Corsair aces, developing the boom and zoom tactics that would become standard doctrine for the type. Walsh understood that whoever controlled altitude controlled the engagement. He would position his division at 25,000 feet or higher, watching for Japanese formations below. When enemy aircraft appeared, he would lead his pilots in diving attacks that used the Corsairs' superior speed to close quickly, fire from effective range, and zoom back to altitude before Japanese fighters could react. If Zeros tried to follow the climbing Corsairs, they found themselves unable to maintain pursuit in the thin air where the American fighters maintained power and speed. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots was becoming evident by mid-1943. Interrogations of captured Zero pilots revealed that they had been specifically warned about the dangers of engaging Corsairs at high altitude. Squadron commanders instructed their pilots to force American fighters down to lower altitudes where the Zero's maneuverability advantages could be exploited. But executing that strategy required Japanese pilots to decline combat when Corsairs held altitude advantage, a tactic that surrendered initiative to the Americans and allowed Marine fighters to attack Japanese bombers and reconnaissance aircraft with relative impunity. The dilemma facing Japanese aviation units was profound. They could either accept combat at altitudes where Corsairs dominated, or they could refuse engagement and watch American fighters ravage their bomber formations. The situation worsened throughout the summer and fall of 1943 as additional Marine squadrons transitioned to Corsairs. VMF 214, which would become famous as the Black Sheep Squadron under Major Gregory Boyington's command, received F4U-1s in August 1943 and immediately began racking up impressive kill totals against Japanese aircraft operating from Rabaul and Bougainville. Boyington, who had previously flown with the American Volunteer Group in China and knew the Zero's capabilities intimately, understood exactly how to exploit the Corsairs' advantages. He emphasized aggressive attacks from altitude, maintaining speed and using the 650 caliber machine guns' superior range and hitting power to destroy Japanese fighters before they could bring their maneuverability to bear. The Black Sheep's operations over the Solomons during the final months of 1943 demonstrated what properly employed Corsairs could accomplish against Japanese air power. Between August and December, the squadron claimed over 100 enemy aircraft destroyed in aerial combat, with Boyington personally accounting for 22 confirmed kills during this period. The squadron's success was built on tactics that maximized the Corsairs' strengths while minimizing exposure to Japanese fighters' turning ability. They fought at altitudes above 20,000 feet whenever possible, used diving attacks to build speed before engaging, and never allowed themselves to be drawn into low-speed turning fights where Zeros held advantages. Japanese responses to the Corsair threat evolved slowly, constrained by industrial limitations and doctrinal rigidity. Newer fighters like the Kawasaki Ki-61 Tony and the Nakajima Ki-84 Frank featured better high-altitude performance than the Zero, but arrived in theater too late and in too few numbers to affect the overall tactical balance. By 1944, American air superiority over the Pacific was so complete that Japanese fighters were increasingly relegated to defensive operations, trying to protect their own bases, and shipping from overwhelming numbers of Allied aircraft that included not just Corsairs but also the excellent Grumman F-6F Hellcat, which achieved similar success through different design approaches. The Corsairs' combat record by the end of World War II was extraordinary by any measure. In the Pacific theater alone, F4Us destroyed over 2,100 Japanese aircraft in aerial combat while losing only 189 Corsairs to enemy fighters. This kill ratio of better than 11-1 was unmatched by any other fighter in the Pacific War and represented a level of air superiority that Japanese pilots could not overcome through skill, courage, or tactical innovation. The statistics told a story of engineering philosophy validated in combat, of American industrial capacity translated into aerial dominance, and of tactical doctrine evolved to exploit technical advantages. Captured Japanese aviation documents studied after the war revealed the extent to which the Corsair had affected enemy operations. Intelligence reports from mid-1944 described the F4U as the most dangerous American fighter in the Pacific, more feared than the Hellcat or even the P-38 Lightning. Japanese pilots referred to the Corsair as Whistling Death, a nickname that captured both the distinctive sound the aircraft made in high-speed dives and the psychological impact it had on enemy aviators who encountered it. The sound came from air flowing through the oil cooler intakes in the wing roots, creating a high-pitched whistle that Japanese soldiers on the ground learned to recognize and dread. The high-altitude advantage that had seemed so theoretical in early 1943 proved decisive in actual combat. At altitudes above 20,000 feet, where the Zero's lightweight construction and single-stage supercharger left it struggling, the Corsair maintained power and speed that Japanese fighters simply could not match. The difference was not marginal, but overwhelming. At 25,000 feet, a Corsair could accelerate away from a pursuing Zero almost at will. At 30,000 feet, the performance gap was so large that combat was essentially one-sided. Japanese pilots who tried to engage Corsairs at these altitudes found themselves outclimbed, outrun, and outgunned by American fighters that seemed to defy the laws of physics that constrained their own aircraft. Lieutenant Robert Klingman's experience on May 10, 1945, demonstrated the Corsair's high-altitude capabilities in extreme form. Flying combat air patrol over Okinawa, Klingman and his wingman spotted a Japanese reconnaissance aircraft at 38,000 feet, far above the altitude where most combat occurred. The two Corsairs climbed to intercept, their R-2800 engines still producing enough power at that extreme altitude to close with the enemy aircraft. When Klingman's guns froze in the thin, cold air, he solved the problem by using his propeller as a cutting blade, literally sawing through the Japanese plane's tail surfaces until it went into an uncontrolled dive. The engagement occurred at an altitude where Zero pilots would have been unable to maintain formation, let alone conduct combat operations. The engineering that made such performance possible represented years of development work by Pratt and Whitney's supercharger specialists. The two-stage system was not simply twice as good as a single-stage design, it was geometrically superior because each compression stage multiplied the effects of the previous stage. The first stage might boost manifold pressure to 15 pounds per square inch above atmospheric. The second stage would then compress that already compressed air further, achieving final manifold pressures that approached 30 pounds per square inch at critical altitude. This level of boost was impossible to achieve with single-stage compression without encountering temperatures that would destroy the engine within minutes. The intercooler between stages made the entire system practical by reducing the temperature of compressed air before it entered the second stage. This cooling accomplished two critical objectives. First, it increased the density of the air, allowing more oxygen molecules to be packed into each cubic inch that entered the cylinders. Second, it prevented the extreme temperatures that would otherwise cause pre-ignition and detonation when the air-fuel mixture was compressed in the cylinders. The intercooler itself was a sophisticated heat exchanger that used ambient air flowing through ducts in the wing roots to cool the compressed air passing through internal passages. The system required precise engineering to balance cooling efficiency against aerodynamic drag and added weight. Japanese engineers understood the principles involved, but lacked the manufacturing capacity and resources to implement similar systems in production aircraft. Building reliable two-stage superchargers required precision machining, high-quality bearings, sophisticated gearing systems, and metallurgy that could withstand the extreme temperatures and stresses of continuous high-altitude operation. American factories could produce these components in quantity, benefiting from decades of industrial development and access to raw materials that Japan's stretched supply lines could not provide. The result was that American fighters could routinely operate at altitudes where Japanese aircraft struggled, creating tactical advantages that skilled pilots could exploit ruthlessly. The Corsair's success at high altitude was not solely about engine performance. The aircraft's structural strength played an equally important role by allowing pilots to conduct violent maneuvers at speeds that would have torn apart lighter fighters. The F4U-1's airframe was designed to withstand loads of 11 positive Gs and 4.5 negative Gs, meaning pilots could pull hard in dives and climbs without worrying about structural failure. The wing spars were massive forgings that carried loads through the fuselage structure, distributing stress across the entire aircraft rather than concentrating it in weak points. The skin was thick enough to resist battle damage that would have been catastrophic to lighter aircraft, and the self-sealing fuel tanks could absorb multiple hits without catching fire. This robustness gave Corsair pilots confidence to push their aircraft to limits that Zero pilots could not match in high-speed dives approaching 500 miles per hour. The Corsair remained controllable while Zeros began experiencing compressibility effects that made the controls heavy and unresponsive. In tight turns at high speed, the Corsair's structure could handle loads that would have torn the wings off a Zero. The weight penalty that made the Corsair less maneuverable at low speeds became an advantage at high speeds where that same mass provided momentum and structural strength that lighter aircraft could not achieve. The 6 50 caliber machine guns that armed most Corsairs provided another significant advantage over Japanese fighters. Each gun fired bullets weighing roughly half an ounce at muzzle velocities approaching 2,900 feet per second. The combined firepower of all 6 guns produced a weight of fire that could destroy enemy aircraft in bursts lasting only a second or two. At ranges beyond 500 yards, where Japanese 7.7mm machine guns were barely effective, the Corsair's 50s could still inflict lethal damage. The ammunition capacity of 400 rounds per gun gave Corsair pilots enough firepower for multiple engagements without returning to base to rearm. Japanese pilots who survived encounters with Corsairs reported the devastating effect of concentrated 50 caliber fire. A single burst that hit a Zero's unprotected fuel tanks would likely ignite the aircraft, and hits to the engine or cockpit area were usually fatal. The psychological impact of facing such overwhelming firepower affected Japanese pilot behavior, making them more cautious and less willing to press attacks when Corsairs were present. Interrogations after the war revealed that experienced Japanese pilots considered the Corsair's firepower as threatening as its performance advantages, describing the effect of 50 caliber hits as catastrophic compared to the smaller caliber weapons on earlier American fighters. By late 1944, the tactical situation had evolved to the point where Japanese fighters were essentially unable to operate effectively in areas where Corsairs maintained air superiority. Marine squadrons flying from bases in the Solomons, the Marshalls, and eventually the Philippines established air superiority zones where Japanese aircraft appeared only at great risk. The high-altitude advantage that Corsairs enjoyed meant they could maintain combat air patrols above Japanese approach routes, intercepting enemy formations before they could reach their targets. The Japanese response increasingly involved sending fighters at treetop level where American radar could not detect them until they were almost overhead, but this tactic surrendered all altitude advantage and left Japanese pilots vulnerable to Corsairs diving from above. The cost to Japan's air forces was catastrophic. Between 1943 and 1945, Japanese naval aviation lost thousands of experienced pilots who could not be replaced given the increasing disruption to training programs as American bombers struck Japanese home islands. Each experienced pilot shot down by a Corsair represented years of training and combat experience that Japan could not afford to lose. The kill ratio of 11-1 meant that for every 11 Japanese pilots killed, only one American Corsair pilot was lost to enemy fighters. This mathematics of attrition guaranteed that American air superiority would increase over time, while Japanese capabilities declined. The final campaigns of the Pacific War demonstrated the complete dominance that properly employed Corsairs could achieve. During the battles for Iwo Jima and Okinawa in 1945, Marine Corsair squadrons, operating from escort carriers and captured airfields, provided continuous air cover over invasion fleets and ground forces. Japanese attempts to attack these positions with kamikaze aircraft and conventional bombers encountered Corsairs orbiting at altitudes where interception was almost guaranteed. The few Japanese fighters that managed to reach combat altitude found themselves completely outmatched by American pilots flying aircraft that maintained full performance in the thin air where Japanese fighters struggled. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.